The frozen forests of the Ardennes whispered with an ominous silence on the morning of December 16th.
1944.
American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, their breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter cold, unaware that they stood on the precipice of what would become Adolf Hitler's final desperate throw of the dice in the depths of his wolf's lair bunker. The Führer paced frantically before a massive map of Western Europe. His trembling hands traced the Allied lines stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, seeking weakness like a predator stalking wounded prey. The Third Reich was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Soviet forces pressed relentlessly from the east, while American and British armies tightened their grip from the west. Germany's industrial cities lay in ruins beneath relentless bombing campaigns, and her armies retreated on all fronts. Main Führer, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, ventured cautiously. "Perhaps we should consider silence." Hitler's voice cracked like a whip through the concrete chamber. His pale blue eyes burned with the fervor of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I have conceived a plan that will split the Western Allies asunder and force them to negotiate a separate peace." The plan that emerged from Hitler's fevered imagination was audacious beyond reason. Operation Watch on the Rhine, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, launched 25 divisions through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest. The same route that had brought Germany's stunning victory in 1940, objective was breathtakingly ambitious: drive northwest to the port city of Antwerp. Cutting Allied supply lines and trapping for entire Allied armies north of the breakthrough, Hitler's generals exchanged worried glances as their leader outlined his vision. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of blitzkrieg tactics, privately considered the plan suicidal. The Wehrmacht of 1944 bore little resemblance to the mighty force that had conquered Poland and France. Fuel shortages plagued every unit, ammunition stocks dwindled daily. Many divisions existed only on paper, filled with teenage conscripts and aging veterans pulled from other fronts. Yet, Hitler's logic possessed a twisted coherence. The Western Front had remained relatively quiet since the Normandy breakout, with Allied forces pausing to consolidate their supply lines and prepare for the final push into Germany. Intelligence reports suggested American units in the Ardennes sector were either green troops gaining experience or battle-weary veterans resting from recent campaigns. If German forces could achieve complete surprise and maintain momentum for just 72 hours, they might reach the Meuse River before Allied reserves could respond. The preparations began in absolute secrecy during late November. Entire divisions moved only at night, their vehicles muffled and headlights dimmed to pinpricks. Radio silence was absolute. All communications traveled by landline or motorcycle courier. Even divisional commanders remained ignorant of the operation's scope until mere days before the attack. According to Stephen Ambrose's detailed account in Citizen Soldiers, the German deception campaign achieved remarkable success, with Allied intelligence completely failing to detect the massive troop buildup. As December progressed, nearly 250,000 German soldiers assembled in the dense forests east of the Ardennes. Tiger and Panther tanks rumbled into camouflaged positions, their crews knowing this would likely be their final offensive action of the war. Artillery pieces, many pulled by horses due to fuel shortages, took aim at American positions they had studied for weeks through periscopes and aerial photographs. The stage was set for Hitler's last great gamble, final desperate attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of inevitable defeat. In the frozen darkness before dawn on December 16th, the fate of the Third Reich would hang in the balance as Operation, which on the Rhine commenced with a thunderous artillery barrage that would echo through history. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, hell erupted across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. The largest artillery barrage launched by German forces since the opening of Operation Barbarossa 3 years earlier shattered the pre-dawn silence, as over 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously on unsuspecting American positions. Private First Class Richard Bruckens of the 106th Infantry Division jerked awake in his foxhole as the earth around him exploded into fountains of frozen dirt and shattered timber. The screaming whistle of incoming shells merged into a continuous, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. "What the hell?" His words were lost as a shell burst 20 yards away, showering him with debris and filling his mouth with the acrid taste of high explosive. The German artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes, methodically pulverizing American command posts, communication centers, and supply depots. When the guns finally fell silent, an eerie quiet descended over the smoking landscape, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the crackle of burning vehicles. Then came the infantry, like gray-green phantoms emerging from the fog. German assault troops advanced through the devastated forest. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Live Standart, Adolf Hitler led the northern prong of the attack, their black-uniformed veterans moving with deadly precision through terrain they had studied for weeks. To the south, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel struck toward the vital road junction of Bastogne, while the 7th Army protected the southern flank. Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding the 110th Infantry Regiment, frantically tried to establish contact with his scattered companies, but German artillery had severed nearly every communication line. Radio messages crackled with confused reports. "We're being overrun. Germans everywhere. Request immediate reinforcement." The fog of war had descended with vengeance, and Fuller realized with growing horror that his regiment faced not a local counterattack, but a full-scale offensive. The German plan unfolded with clockwork precision in those first crucial hours. Kampfrat Peiper, led by the notorious SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, spearheaded the advance toward the Meuse River bridges. Peiper's battle group consisted of over 5,000 men and 100 tanks, including the feared King Tiger heavy tanks that could destroy any Allied armor at ranges exceeding 2 miles. Military historian John Toland noted in Battle, the Story of the Bulge, that American forces initially dismissed the attack as a limited German spoiling operation, failing to grasp its true scope until precious hours had been lost. By midday, German spearheads had penetrated up to 6 miles into American lines. At several points, the inexperienced troops of the 106th Infantry Division, holding positions they had occupied for only 5 days, found themselves completely surrounded in the village of Sankt Vith. Radio operator Sergeant Frank Rayla sent increasingly desperate messages. Enemy tanks approaching from 3 directions, running low on ammunition. Request permission to withdraw. But withdrawal proved impossible for many units caught in the German tide. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion found itself isolated near Malmedy when German armor cut the roads behind them. Kampfrat Peipers. Tanks rumbled past their concealed positions. The artillerymen could only watch helplessly as their escape routes disappeared. The shock of the German offensive reverberated through Allied command structures like an earthquake. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower received the first fragmentary reports with disbelief. How could German forces, supposedly on the verge of collapse, launch such a massive coordinated attack? Intelligence estimates had predicted the Wehrmacht possessed neither the men nor materiel for offensive operations of this magnitude. As darkness fell on December 16th, the true scope of Hitler's gamble became apparent. German forces had achieved tactical surprise along the entire front, shattering 2 American divisions and threatening to isolate 2 more. The weather favored the attackers. Heavy clouds grounded Allied air power, while fog and snow limited visibility to mere yards in many sectors. Yet even in those first dark hours, signs of German weakness began to manifest. Fuel shortages forced many tank units to abandon vehicles short of their objectives, while inadequate winter clothing left infantry shivering in temperatures well below freezing. The Wehrmacht of December 1944 was a hollow shell of its former self, and this final offensive would either restore German fortunes or exhaust the Reich's last reserves in a futile gesture. The morning of December 17th, 1944 dawned gray and bitter across the Ardennes, with fresh snow beginning to fall as Kampfrat Peiper continued its relentless drive toward the Meuse River. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, 29-year-old veteran, whose baby face belied his reputation for ruthlessness, pushed his battle group forward with the urgency of a man racing against time itself. Peiper understood better than most that the success of Operation Watch on the Rhine hinged entirely on speed. His orders were explicit: reach the Meuse bridges within 48 hours, regardless of cost or casualties. Behind him, the entire offensive would either triumph or collapse, based on whether his spearhead could maintain momentum through the crucial first days of the attack. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Piper's lead elements encountered a most unexpected prize near the crossroads hamlet of Malmedy. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, consisting of over 100 American soldiers, had been retreating westward when they stumbled directly into the path of the German advance. The Americans, caught completely by surprise on the open road, surrendered without firing a shot. What happened next would forever stain the reputation of the Waffen. SSN provide Allied propaganda with one of its most powerful weapons. The American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the Kaf Bodar, their hands raised high as German tank crews looked down from their armored vehicles with undisguised contempt. Private First Class Homer Ford of Pittsburgh stood among the captured Americans, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he watched German soldiers debate among themselves in harsh, guttural tones. Ford noticed the lightning bolt runes on their collars and felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. Stories about SS treatment of prisoners had circulated through American ranks for months, but surely they wouldn't dare massacre over 100 men in broad daylight. According to Charles Whiting's extensively researched account and massacre at Malmedy, the exact sequence of events remains disputed, but witness testimonies consistently describe a premeditated execution rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Without warning, a German machine gun opened fire from one of the half-tracks. Prisoners, packed tightly together in the field, had nowhere to run as bullets tore through their ranks. Men screamed, fell, and died in the blood-stained snow, while German soldiers continued firing into the writhing mass of bodies. Some Americans attempted to flee toward the nearby woods, only to be cut down by rifle fire or crushed beneath tank treads. Private Ford threw himself to the ground and lay motionless, as warm blood from the man beside him soaked through his uniform. The firing continued for several minutes, punctuated by single shots as German soldiers moved among the bodies, finishing off anyone who showed signs of life. Ford counted seconds that felt like hours, fighting the urge to move or cry out as boots crunched through the snow mere inches from his head. When the Germans finally departed, 84 Americans lay dead in the field at Malmedy. 19 survivors, including Ford, managed to escape into the surrounding forest and eventually reached Allied lines with their horrific tale. Word of the massacre spread through American units like wildfire, transforming what had begun as tactical withdrawal into grim determination to exact revenge. Meanwhile, Piper's advance continued toward the village of Stoumont, where his battle group would face its first serious resistance. The delay at Malmedy had cost precious time, and American reinforcements were beginning to react to the German offensive. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division raced eastward to block the German spearhead, their Sherman tanks and tank destroyers taking up defensive positions along the narrow roads that channeled all movement through the densely forested terrain. The topography of the Ardennes, which had initially favored German infiltration tactics, now began working against the attackers. Steep-sided valleys and thick forests confined armored vehicles to a limited road network, creating natural bottlenecks where a few determined defenders could delay entire divisions. Piper's massive King Tiger tanks, virtually invulnerable in open combat, found themselves trapped on roads too narrow for maneuvering and too weak to support their enormous weight. As December 17th drew to a close, Kampfrupp Piper had advanced nearly 20 miles from its starting positions, but remained over 30 miles from the Meuse River bridges. More ominously for German hopes, Allied reserves were converging on the breakthrough zone from all directions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, veterans of D-Day and Operation Market Garden, received emergency deployment. Orders to contain the German penetration. Hitler's gamble had achieved stunning initial success, punching a massive hole in Allied lines and capturing thousands of prisoners. Yet the massacre at Malmedy would prove to be a strategic disaster for German forces, stiffening American resistance and providing justification for increasingly harsh treatment of SS prisoners. The window for German victory was already beginning to close, though the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead, as dawn broke on December 19th. 1944, the vital road junction of Bastogne found itself completely surrounded by German forces. The small Belgian town, home to barely 4,000 civilians, had suddenly become the fulcrum upon which Hitler's entire offensive would turn. 7 roads converged at Bastogne like spokes on a wheel, making it the key to movement throughout the southern Ardennes. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division stood in the cellar of the Heinz barracks, studying maps by candlelight as German artillery shells crashed overhead. McAuliffe, a compact man with steel-gray hair and an unflappable demeanor, had arrived in Bastogne just 18 hours earlier with advance elements of his division. What he found was chaos, retreating American units streaming through the town, civilians fleeing westward with their possessions loaded on handcarts, and contradictory reports about German locations. Flooding in from all directions, the situation had deteriorated with stunning rapidity. General Hasso von Mantefel's 5th Panzer Army had achieved complete tactical surprise, with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and Panzer Lehr Division converging on Bastogne from multiple directions. By December 18th, German forces had severed all roads leading into the town, trapping over 11,000 American defenders inside what military historians would later call the key to the Ardennes. McAuliffe's paratroopers had reached Bastogne aboard a convoy of trucks that arrived just hours before the German encirclement closed. Many of the airborne soldiers still wore the light equipment and summer uniforms they had been issued for their previous mission in Holland, wholly inadequate for the brutal winter conditions in the Ardennes. Ammunition was critically short, medical supplies nearly exhausted, and the defending force included a bewildering mixture of paratroopers, armored units, artillery batteries, and miscellaneous support troops who had been swept up in the German advance. The German assault on Bastogne began in earnest on December 20th with a coordinated attack from 3 directions. Obersthein's-Coquet's 26th Volksgrenadier Division struck from the north and east, while elements of Panzer Lehr attacked from the south and west. The defenders, organized into a circular perimeter around the town, found themselves under constant pressure as German infantry probed for weak points in their hastily constructed defenses. Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive research in Band of Brothers reveals that many paratroopers later described the siege of Bastogne as more terrifying than their D-Day jump, due to the combination of artillery bombardment, sub-zero temperatures, and complete isolation from friendly forces. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuz of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment positioned his men in foxholes along the Longueville Road, the main eastern approach to Bastogne. His soldiers, many of them veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, dug their positions in ground, frozen solid as concrete. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, and many paratroopers suffered from frostbite as severe as their battle wounds. The most dramatic moment of the siege occurred on December 22nd, when 4 German officers approached. American lines under a white flag, Major Alvin Jones of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment met the German delegation at an outpost near the village of Remoifus, where they presented him with a formal surrender ultimatum. The German message, typed on official Wehrmacht letterhead, was addressed to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It warned that the garrison faced total annihilation unless it surrendered within 2 hours, and promised honorable treatment as prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The ultimatum concluded with an ominous threat if this proposal should be rejected. 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. When the German demand reached McAuliffe at his command post, the general's response became one of the most famous in American military history. After reading the ultimatum, McAuliffe looked up at his staff officers and uttered a single word: nuts. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, suggested they send that exact response back to the Germans, and McAuliffe agreed without hesitation. The German officers who received McAuliffe's reply appeared genuinely confused by the American slang. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the message, was forced to explain that nuts meant go to hell in decidedly more polite terms. The German delegation departed with obvious displeasure, and the bombardment of Bastogne intensified markedly. Over the following hours, as December 22nd drew to a close, the defenders of Bastogne faced their darkest hour. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly, while Luftwaffe bombers made their first significant appearance over the battlefield in months. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per rifle. Medical supplies were exhausted, and many wounded. Soldiers lay in freezing cellars without adequate care, yet unknown to the beleaguered garrison. Relief was already racing toward them through the winter darkness. General George Patton's Third Army had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history, pivoting 90 degrees from its advance toward the Saar Basin and driving north toward the besieged town. The question was whether Patton's tanks could reach Bastogne before the German noose tightened beyond hope of escape. The morning of December 3rd, 1944 brought an unexpected gift to the beleaguered defenders of Bastogne and the entire Allied cause in the Ardennes: clear skies. For the first time since the German offensive began, brilliant sunshine pierced through the heavy cloud cover that had grounded Allied air power for nearly a week. The weather front that meteorologists would later call the Christmas miracle transformed the tactical situation in a matter of hours. Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch of the 406 Fighter Group stood on the frozen runway at St. Trond Airfield in Belgium, watching ground crews frantically prepare his P-47 Thunderbolts for their first combat mission in days. The massive radial engines coughed to life in the bitter cold, their exhaust creating billowing clouds of vapor as pilots performed hasty pre-flight checks. Crouch knew that every minute counted. German forces throughout the Ardennes had grown accustomed to moving in daylight without fear of air attack, and they would pay dearly for that overconfidence. By 10 o'clock that morning, over 2,000 Allied aircraft filled the winter sky above the Ardennes in the largest single-day air operation of the European war. Medium bombers struck German supply lines and troop concentrations, while fighter bombers prowled the forest roads hunting for targets of opportunity. The psychological impact on German forces proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers who had advanced boldly for a week suddenly found themselves diving for cover at the sound of approaching engines. Meanwhile, skewed 60 miles to the south, General George Smith Patton Jr. paced impatiently in his command post at Luxembourg City, monitoring radio reports from his advancing columns. The most flamboyant and controversial American commander in Europe had achieved what many military experts considered impossible: pivoting an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and launching a coordinated attack within 72 hours of receiving orders. Patton's Third Army advance toward Bastogne represented military logistics at their finest. The 4th Armored Division led the attack up the Arlon-Bastogne Highway, followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions advancing on parallel routes. Supply convoys stretched for miles behind the combat units, carrying the ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies desperately needed by McAuliffe's surrounded garrison, according to Martin Blumensen's authoritative biography. Patton, the man behind the legend. The general had been secretly planning a northward attack for days before receiving official orders. Anticipating that the German offensive would require Third Army intervention, Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spearheaded the relief effort with characteristic aggressiveness. Abrams, whose Sherman tank Thunderbolt 4th had become famous throughout the European theater, pushed his men relentlessly toward the besieged town. Despite fierce German resistance, his task force encountered determined opposition from the 5th Parachute Division and elements of Panzer Lehr, German units that had been diverted from the Bastogne siege to block the American relief effort. The fighting along the Arlon-Bastogne road was savage and uncompromising. German paratroops, many of them teenagers, impressed from the Luftwaffe ground crews, fought with desperate courage in carefully prepared positions. Panzerfaust teams stalked American tanks through the dense forests, while German artillery observers called down devastating barrages on the narrow roads that channeled all movement through the broken terrain. Inside Bastogne, the sound of approaching combat filled the defenders with desperate hope. Sergeant Don Malarkey of Easy Company, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, crouched in his frozen foxhole listening to the distant rumble of artillery moving steadily closer. After 4 days of encirclement, ammunition was so scarce that men were ordered to fire only when they could see the whites of German eyes. Medical supplies had been exhausted 2 days earlier, and wounded paratroopers lay in the town's cellars without morphine or adequate bandages. The German response to Patton's advance was swift and desperate. Field Marshal Walther Model, commanding Army Group B, ordered the 47 Panzer Corps to break off its attack on Bastogne and meet the American relief force head-on. The resulting collision between two armored spearheads produced some of the most intense fighting of the entire offensive, with tank battles raging across the frozen fields south of the besieged town. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Combat Command A reached the village of Essenois, less than 4 miles from Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion spotted a cluster of foxholes ahead and cautiously approached with his tank crew ready for action. To his amazement, the soldiers emerging from the positions wore American uniforms and displayed the distinctive white bandanas that identified the 101st Airborne Division. "Come here," shouted one of the paratroopers, running toward Bogus's Sherman tank. "You're wanted in Bastogne." The siege was broken. After 6 days of isolation, the defenders of Bastogne had held their vital road junction against overwhelming odds. German forces still surrounded much of the town, and heavy fighting would continue for days, but the psychological impact of Patton's breakthrough was enormous. Hitler's offensive had been stopped at its most critical point, and the initiative was beginning to shift back to Allied forces. As Christmas dawned over the Ardennes, both sides prepared for the climactic phase of the battle. The German High Command faced a terrible choice: continue the offensive with dwindling resources, or acknowledge that Operation Watch on the Rhine had failed and begin withdrawing to more defensible positions. Hitler, predictably, chose to double down on his desperate gamble, setting the stage for even bloodier fighting in the days ahead. December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day dawned cold and clear over the Ardennes, but brought little peace to the exhausted armies locked in mortal combat throughout the Belgian forests. The German offensive had reached its high water mark, with advanced elements of the 2nd Panzer Division approaching within 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinant. Yet even as Kampfrupp, BHM prepared for what they hoped would be the final assault on the bridges that represented German salvation. The tide of battle was already turning against the Wehrmacht. Oberst Meinrad von Laukert, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, stood in the church tower of Celles, studying the Meuse Valley through his field glasses. The broad river sparkled in the winter sunlight, tantalizingly close after 8 days of continuous fighting. Beyond those bridges lay the road to Antwerp, and the possibility, however remote, of splitting the Allied coalition in two. But Laukert was an experienced commander, and what he observed through his binoculars filled him with foreboding rather than hope. British tanks of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment had taken up defensive positions along the western bank of the Meuse. Their guns trained on every bridge and ford. More ominously, American forces were converging on his exposed flanks from 3 directions, threatening to cut his division's supply lines and trap his remaining tanks in a deadly pocket. The fuel situation had become desperate beyond description. Many German tanks sat motionless in the forests around Celles, their crews having siphoned every drop of gasoline from disabled vehicles to keep a handful of panzers operational. The Luftwaffe, despite Hermann Göring's promises, had failed to deliver adequate supplies by air, and the single road connecting Lauchert's division to German lines was under constant attack by Allied fighter-bombers. John Toland's meticulous research and battle. The story of the Bulge documents how German fuel shortages became so severe that some tank crews attempted to operate their vehicles on a mixture of gasoline and alcohol looted from Belgian homes. Major General Ernest Harman of the 2nd Armored division had been monitoring German movements around cells for 2 days, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. Harman, a grizzled tank commander who had learned his trade in the North African desert, recognized that the 2nd Panzer Division represented the deepest German penetration of the entire offensive. Destroying the spearhead would not only eliminate a dangerous threat, but also serve notice that the German advance had been definitively halted. On the morning of December 26th, Harman launched Operation Tally-Ho, a coordinated assault designed to annihilate the exposed German salient. Combat Command A attacked from the north, while Combat Command B struck from the south. With the British 3rd Royal Tank Regiment blocking all escape routes across the Meuse, the German defenders, caught with empty fuel tanks and dwindling ammunition, found themselves trapped in a steadily contracting pocket. The destruction of Camp Frupp BHM was swift and merciless. American Sherman tanks, supported by tank destroyers and artillery, systematically reduced German strongpoints, while Thunderbolts strafed anything that moved on the roads behind the front lines. By evening, over 80 German tanks and assault guns lay scattered across the snowy fields around cells, many of them abandoned by crews who had fled on foot toward distant German lines. The catastrophe at Cells marked the effective end of German offensive capabilities in the Ardennes. Hitler's gamble had consumed the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves, leaving the German army with insufficient strength to continue the attack or conduct an orderly withdrawal. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging commander of German forces in the West, privately informed his staff that the war was lost and Germany must seek immediate peace negotiations. Yet, Hitler remained delusional about German prospects even as his armies disintegrated around him. From his bunker headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer continued issuing impossible orders for renewed offensives, apparently unable to comprehend that the Wehrmacht of December 1944 lacked the men, equipment, and fuel necessary. To sustain major combat operations, the human cost of the failed offensive was staggering. German casualties exceeded 120,000 men, including many irreplaceable veterans and experienced officers. Tank losses approached 800 vehicles, representing more armor than Germany could produce in 3 months under wartime conditions. Most critically, the Luftwaffe had exhausted its remaining reserves of trained pilots and aviation, fuel in a series of futile gestures that accomplished nothing beyond hastening the air force's final collapse. American losses were also severe. Over 19,000 killed, wounded, and missing, but the United States possessed the industrial capacity and manpower reserves to replace these casualties. Britain and Canada rushed reinforcements across the Atlantic, while American factories increased production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition to support the final push into Germany. As December drew to a close, Allied forces began their own offensive. Operations designed to eliminate the German Bulge and restore the front lines to their pre-attack positions. The roles had reversed completely. German forces now found themselves fighting desperate defensive actions while Allied armies seized the initiative and began planning the invasion of the German homeland. The Battle of the Bulge had become Hitler's Waterloo, a final catastrophic gamble that consumed Germany's remaining strength and opened the road to Berlin. The Third Reich would survive for another 4 months, but its fate had been sealed in the snowy forests of the Ardennes during those crucial days between December 16th and December 26, 1944. The bitter winds of January 1945 swept across the scarred landscape of the Ardennes, carrying with them the acrid smell of burning vehicles and the weight of shattered dreams. What remained of Hitler's once mighty war machine was retreating eastward in disorder, abandoning the battlefield where the Führer had staked everything on one final throw of the dice. The Battle of the Bulge was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, and with it, the last realistic hope of German victory in the Second World War. General Omar Bradley stood amid the rubble of Sankt Vith on January 23rd, surveying the devastation wrought by 5 weeks of intensive combat. The small Belgian town had changed hands multiple times during the fighting, and scarcely a building remained intact. Bradley, the soft-spoken commander of the 12th Army Group, felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as he watched American engineers clearing roadblocks and establishing supply routes through the recaptured territory. The statistics told the story of German defeat more eloquently than any propaganda. Hitler's offensive had cost the Wehrmacht over 120,000 casualties, including 800 tanks and assault guns that could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe, making its last significant appearance over the Western Front, had lost nearly 800 aircraft in futile attempts to support the ground offensive. Most catastrophically, Germany had expended its final strategic reserves in a gamble that achieved nothing beyond hastening the Reich's collapse. According to Charles Gonald's official U.S. Army history, the last offensive, German fuel shortages, became so acute during the final phase of the battle that entire tank battalions were abandoned when their vehicles ran out of gasoline. The human tragedy extended far beyond military casualties. Thousands of Belgian and Luxembourg civilians had been caught in the crossfire, their homes destroyed and families scattered by the sudden eruption of warfare in what had been relatively peaceful territory. The massacre at Malmedy had shocked Allied public opinion and stiffened resistance to any negotiated settlement with Nazi Germany. There would be no separate peace. There was no breathing space for Hitler to rebuild his shattered forces. Hitler himself remained in denial about the magnitude of his defeat, even as Soviet armies closed in on Berlin from the east. From his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the Führer continued issuing fantastical orders for counteroffensives that existed only in his fevered imagination. He blamed his generals for the failure in the Ardennes, dismissed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt for the second time, spoke of miracle weapons that would yet turn the tide of war. The reality was far different. Germany's transportation network lay in ruins beneath relentless Allied bombing, making it impossible to move reinforcements or supplies to threatened sectors. Industrial production had virtually ceased in many regions, and the Wehrmacht was reduced to inducting 16-year-old boys and 60-year-old men to fill its depleted ranks. The country that had once dominated Europe from the Atlantic to the Volga was being crushed between converging Allied armies that grew stronger with each passing day. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, recognized that the Battle of the Bulge had fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Europe. The German offensive had actually accelerated Allied victory by forcing Hitler to commit his last reserves in a hopeless cause. With the Wehrmacht crippled beyond recovery, Eisenhower began planning Operation Plunder, the final assault across the Rhine River that would carry its Allied forces into the heart of Germany. The broader consequences of Hitler's failed gamble extended far beyond the military sphere. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated to Stalin that the Western Allies were fully committed to Germany's unconditional surrender, eliminating any possibility of a separate peace between the Soviet Union and the Anglo-American coalition. This unity among the Allies would prove crucial during the final months of fighting. As German propaganda desperately attempted to split the coalition through promises of joint resistance against Bolshevism, for the German people, the failure in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the end. Many civilians who had maintained faith in ultimate victory despite years of bombing and privation finally acknowledged that the war was lost. Refugees streamed westward from the advancing Soviet forces, while those remaining in the cities prepared for inevitable occupation by foreign armies. The military lessons of the Battle of the Bulge would influence tactical thinking for decades. German success in achieving initial surprise, despite massive troop movements, demonstrated the continued importance of operational security and deception. Allied recovery from near disaster highlighted the critical role of flexible command structures and rapid reinforcement capabilities. Most significantly, the battle proved that modern warfare had become too complex and resource-intensive for any nation to sustain indefinitely without secure supply lines and industrial capacity. As February 1945 dawned over Europe, the Third Reich entered its final death throes. Allied armies stood poised to cross the Rhine and drive into Germany itself, while Soviet forces prepared for the climactic assault on Berlin. Hitler's last major offensive had not only failed catastrophically, but had actually hastened the very outcome it was designed to prevent. The Ardennes offensive would be remembered as the moment when Nazi Germany's fate was definitively sealed. In those frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, amid the thunder of artillery and the screams of dying men, the Third Reich had gambled everything and lost. The road to Berlin now lay open, and nothing could prevent the final reckoning that awaited Adolf Hitler and his collapsing empire. The Battle of the Bulge stands as perhaps the most vivid illustration of how desperate gambles in war often achieve the exact opposite of their intended purpose. Hitler's attempt to split the Western Allies instead united them in their determination to achieve unconditional German surrender. His effort to buy time for Germany merely accelerated the Reich's collapse by squandering irreplaceable reserves. In a futile gesture, in the end, the Battle of the Bulge was indeed Hitler's last major offensive, not because he chose to make it so, but because he no longer possessed the means to launch another. The Wehrmacht that limped back across the German frontier in January 1945 was a broken force, incapable of anything beyond delaying actions as the Reich crumbled around it. The Führer's final gamble had failed, and with it died the last hope of Nazi victory in the Second World War.